Hello, my name is Danny Nolan and I'm the Director of Chassis Sim Technologies. And welcome to this latest episode of Dan's Vehicle Dynamics Corner. And today, ladies and gentlemen, we have something very important to discuss. Electric vehicles, the state of play and the current war being waged on the internal combustion engine. And this is one of these videos, ladies and gentlemen, that any one of you familiar with my writing in race car engineering would be well familiar with the fact that I've written a couple of articles about this. I've also been meaning to make a video on this for a while, but a number of my colleagues have counseled me against this because of just how crazily polarized the environmental green debate has become. That being said, when you've got governments that are starting to make very ill-informed decisions, like for example, the ACT state government in Australia has decided to ban the sale of new internal combustion engines post 2035. And this proposal is currently before the EU Parliament. And the problem with a lot of these decisions is they are being made in a vacuum of proper engineering and proper engineering and scientific knowledge. And this is really what I want to talk about today, because when you've got crazy decisions like this, it's beholden on people like myself who are grown-ups working at the coalface to speak up on these matters. So let's get started. So, if you, unless you've been living under a rock for the last 10 years, there has been an absolute mad rush in both motorsport and OEM Automotive to adopt electric vehicles. And as I have alluded to before, there's also a very big legislative push to ban the internal combustion engine. But the question has to be asked, do the numbers add up? And we're going to be talking about this at length. So let's get started. So, first things first, it would be beholden on me to put Chassis Sim's EV credentials before you all. So this is an example of our motorsport EV correlation. As always, actual is coloured, simulated is black. So as we can see, speed, RPM, steer, throttle, lateral inline G, gear, all match up relatively well. And as we can see with the electric vehicle parameters, the pack voltage, your charge power, your current draw on the pack, they're all within the same ballpark. Now, full disclosure here, this was an example of your initial first generation of the Chassis Sim EV powertrain toolbox. And because of the work that we've done in Formula E, and also too, there's a number of other electric vehicle projects we're currently involved on that I've absolutely sworn to secrecy on, I can't show you current correlation. That being said, this should lay down the credentials that the Chassis Sim EV powertrain toolbox is perfectly fit for purpose. Also too, on a personal note, for the last 25 years or so, I have been flying electrically powered radio-controlled high-performance aircraft. I started in the NICAD era, where you had planes that could barely cope with 15k an hour winds. And I've seen the whole gambit going from NICAD, nickel metal hydride, through to the various evolution of lithium polymer cells, from brush to brushless batteries. And now I fly regularly aircraft that are 150 to 250k an hour electric-powered fire-breathing monsters. So I've seen the whole gambit. I've also lost count of the number of ESCs, battery packs, and motors that I've blown up. So suffice to say, I've got a bit of skin in the game here. So suffice to say, this is not going to be one of these intellectual think tank kind of chats where you've got a bunch of people who are just talking as if they're at some crazy art students convention. What you're seeing here is based on hard-won experience. Okay, first things first, I've really got to touch base about the insanity of how we got here. And the reason we've gotten to a point where you've got such a skewed debate on these matters is how crazily polarized the environmental debate has become. In the red corner, we have the Donald and his ilk, who will contend there's nothing to see here, there's no problem, etc., etc. It's all just a beat up. In the blue corner, we have Greta Thunberg and her ilk, who are absolutely convinced that the world is going to end tomorrow. And what is ironic is both of these camps believe in absolute polar opposites, if you try and talk sense to either of these parties, you might as well be wasting your time. And that, folks, is why we've gotten to a point where it's become virtually impossible to have a sane discussion about this. And really, the whole point of our discussion today is to try and inject a little bit of sanity into this discussion. Now, it would also be behove for me to lay my cards on the table where I stand on this. For me, there are two. For me, I actually do support aggressive action on moving to a carbon neutral infrastructure, and I do this for two reasons. Number one, the planet deserves the benefit of the doubt. But the other factor that we often don't talk about is energy security. So let's just break that down very, very briefly. So this image here is the famous Earthrise taken from the Apollo 8 capsule, and image is courtesy of NASA. Make no mistake, folks, our planet is an absolute jewel, and we don't do a good job of taking care of it. And I'm just going to say that. That's not, now, that is not something that's particularly controversial. It's just a statement of fact. Also, too, if we take a look at our current sources of energy, in particular, our current energy sources for mobility, we're talking fuel, etc., etc. While not wanting to generate undue controversy, these are coming from governments who aren't exactly going to be sending us Christmas cards anytime soon. So, for me, from both a risk management perspective and from an energy security perspective, moving to a carbon neutral infrastructure makes a truckload of sense. That being said, the problem that what we really need to discuss is the way of how we get there, because quite frankly, what is currently on the table borders on the absolutely insane. So let's get into it. Okay, first things first, let's talk about the advantages of electric vehicles. It boils down to two things: packaging and throttle response. So what we've got here, folks, is this is the best RC helicopter pilot on the planet, a fellow by the name of Tariq Al-Sadi. Now, he can do stuff with an electric-powered RC helicopter that you simply could not do on an internal combustion-powered equivalent, and that all boils down to the throttle response. This particular aircraft here is called an Extreme Flight Extra V2 60-inch EXP. I've got over 450 to 500 flights on that thing. Now, that can do stuff that that can do stuff at ease that you would be hard pressed to do with an internal combustion engine. Also, too, this here, and to underscore that, here is an image of the Remy HV250 motor. Note the packaging here. You've got something that's 103 to 144 mil wide and has a diameter of 242 mils. To say that this offers huge steps forward in terms of packaging is an understatement. And in particular, EV solves problems like all-wheel drive and the differential that's an absolute dog's breakfast that you would do with an internal combustion engine. And an EV solves those problems incredibly elegantly. So there's tremendous promise in electric vehicles. So the question needs to be asked, why have EVs got the traction that they have? So here is why EVs have gotten the traction they have. What has happened is over the last 20 years, as the energy density started to increase, having a car run on a single charge for 400 kilometers is now commonplace. That being said, the devil is in the detail here, and here's a typical throttle profile for a road car. I draw your attention to the full throttle trace, which is the throttle position. Take a look at the fact that you're barely looking at maybe 10, maybe 20% of throttle, and that was actually me being overly generous in terms of throttle application. So when you add that up over a battery charge, that is why you've got, okay, that's why you've got for road car applications, a EV able to go the 400 kilometers. So you combine this with Tesla Model S's outdragging Porsches. This added fuel to the fire. And where it became particularly dangerous is very sadly, this current cohort of politicians and senior bureaucrats who are making key decisions right now are both STEM and numerically illiterate. So consequently, they didn't have the full range of knowledge to go, oh, hang on, this is great, but there's a but here. And here's the but. The but is when you start to need performance. This shows up the fact that the current energy density of battery-powered EVs, they're enough to be usable, but they're not enough to be compelling. So a number of articles that I've written for Race Car Engineering on this topic. The first article, I explored the prospect of an electric GT3 contender for the Bathurst 12 Hour. So I went through, did your typical typical stint analysis that you would do for for a GT3 car. It's typically about 45 minutes for the Bathurst 12 Hour, give or take. And so going through, calculating out on your current battery energy densities, and I was making a lot of generous assumptions. You're looking at a battery pack of about 1,264.8 kilos. So then I took it back a step and said, okay, well, could you use this for something like a sprint event, something like World Time Attack Challenge? And even in that situation, giving it a lot of generous assumptions, like using a Lotus Elise chassis with using a Lotus Elise with a carbon chassis, you're looking in the order of about 2,000 cells, and that's just for a sprint event. So we're talking an outlap, a flyer, an outlap, a flyer, and back in. So that really underscores the fact that a real weakness of battery-powered EVs right now is the fact that your energy density is still marginal. Okay, the mechanics of charging. When we talk about battery charging, we typically talk in terms of capacity or C of the cells. So most lithium-ion LiPo cells can be charged at 1C or about an hour. Now, for hobby applications, whether you're running radio-controlled cars, radio-controlled aircraft, drones, etc., this all works out really. This all works out really well. That being said, most battery packs for EV vehicles fall between about the 40 to 80 kilowatt hour capacity. So that means to charge for an hour, you're going to need 20 to 40 power points in series at a time. It even becomes much more prohibitive for fast charging. Now, the good news about fast charging is that your latest generation of lithium-ion LiPo cells, or for example, Thunder Power cells that have got considerable use for the high-end use for hobby applications, can be charged at 5C. But you multiply that by 5C, you're starting to talk power requirements in the order of about 340, you're talking about 340 or so kilowatts. So I'm just going to get you to park that for the time being. The dark side of EV, the required resources. Now, if you're going down the Tesla route of 85 kilowatt hour batteries, you're talking battery packs of about 600 kilos. When you're talking about electrifying trucks, your battery pack masses become a lot higher. So if you factor in house batteries, you could be typically looking at an individual mass budget of about 1,000 kilograms, give or take. I realize it's a little bit vague, but it's a good back of the beer coaster calculation to hold your hat on. So if you're going to replace 2 billion cars and trucks over 20 years using battery-powered EV, you are looking at 100 million tons of raw materials per year. Now, to put that in perspective, that's about a quarter of Australia's coal exports, give or take. Now, to any greenie slash battery-powered EV advocates who are tuning into this, who are currently banging off the rev limiter right now, I want to state very clearly that for me, battery-powered EVs do have an important role to play. For example, if we take a look at cars of, say, a Toyota, cars of the category, say, a Toyota Yaris, a Suzuki Swift, a Volkswagen Caddy, when you are going from point to point with a typical range of about 150, or actually, let me rephrase, a typical useful radii of about 150, 200 kilometers. And when you are driving charge point to point, they have a very, very important role to play. Also, on another topic as well, battery-powered EV could be an absolute savior for general aviation on the simple principle of the fact that because the economics of general aviation are so borderline, the great thing about battery-powered EV is the fact that it takes those aircraft cost per flight hour and basically pretty much drops them to zero because of just how because of just how maintenance-free electric vehicles is. Because the great thing about electric motors, if you run them in with their temperature with regards to their temperature, load, and current and voltage limits, if you keep running them within that, they're going to last for forever. As a case in point, that image I showed you of my Extreme Flight Extra V2 EXP, the motor in that has got 400 flights on it, and these are 400 hard flights, and it's just smiled at me and kept on coming. And that's one of the great things about electric vehicles, and particularly for those smaller applications, battery-powered EV has an important role to play. Now, another approach to EV is hydrogen power. So typically what you're using hydrogen as fuel for a fuel cell, and you're using modest battery regen. Now, GreenGT, who are based in France, have done great work pioneering this. So what you've got is an LMP2 category car. You've got a car that weighs about 1,400 kilos, can be refueled in about 4 minutes. I'm sure the guys from GreenGT will correct me if I've made an error on that, and has endurance comparable to its size counterparts. And all great credit to GreenGT for the great work that they have done on this. That being said, the question remains about producing and storing hydrogen en masse, and also too, this technology is not yet the finished article. So there's still a bit of a ways to go, but nonetheless, it is promising indeed. One of my former colleagues at Race Car Engineering, Ricardo Dilvia, who sadly left the party way too early, wrote at length about this, and I'd refer you to those articles in Race Car Engineering. So, given all this, dispensing with the internal combustion engine is total madness. And I mean madness with a capital M. Because here's the thing, the internal combustion engine right now is unsurpassed, both in energy density and convenience. There's an old saying, what fits in a teacup and goes a kilometre, petroleum or a petroleum equivalent. However, the real issue, and that for me has been the huge blind spot in this debate, is how you generate the fuel. And I'm going to get you to park that forward, and we'll talk about that momentarily. So, also too, when we talk about battery-powered EV, we have to discuss the grid that this is plugged into, and this really brings us to a very, very important topic. Can renewables on their own save us? So, unless you've been living under a rock for the last 10 years, you cannot ignore the push for wind and solar. Now, currently, solar has an output of about 600 watts per square metre, give or take. A typical wind turbine is about 2.5 to 3 megawatts. Now, all of this is brilliant for domestic consumption. Now, typically, most domestic homes will typically chew up about 10 kilowatt hours per day. To verify that, just look at your electricity bill. But of course, the question has to be asked: what happens on a cloudy and a still day? And further to this discussion, can renewables on their own save us? Let's now look at industrial requirements. If you want to produce 1 kilo of hydrogen, you're looking at an energy requirement of 40 to 45 kilowatt hours. So, just to keep the numbers simple, looking at transmission losses and the like, you're probably going to need in the order of 70 to 80 square meters of solar cells to produce 1 kilo of hydrogen. And while you're mulling on that, to produce 1 ton of steel, you're looking at approximately 6 megawatt hours of energy. Now, synthetic fuels, energy requirements vary. Now, one source puts 1 gallon of fuel at 64 kilowatt hours. Now, I just want to talk very, very briefly about synthetic fuels, even though they're slightly beyond the scope of this debate, scope of our discussion today, but related to it. Synthetic fuels do have quite a bit of an historical background. For example, during World War II, the Germans relied very, very heavily on synthetic fuels, albeit they produced suboptimal octane ratings. And for further details on that, I would refer you to the book The Secret Horsepower Race, written by a good friend of mine, Callum Douglas. As far as I'm concerned, one of the most definitive technical histories that have ever been written, full stop, and it's worth a read. Also, too, a synthetic fuel plant was established in South Africa in the early 90s that could produce about 7 gallons per day. But if that's wrong, I'm sure someone will pull me up on it. So, synthetic fuels, while the technology to produce this en masse is still immature, is nonetheless a viable option, albeit it does need funding. That being said, if we take a look at all these energy requirements, these numbers are very, very stark in the fact that while renewables have a very, very important role to play, if you think that renewables in and of themselves are going to save us, then sadly you are doomed to disappointment. That's why we need to talk about the N word, nuclear. If we're serious about a zero carbon future, we've got to discuss nuclear power. It is an absolute given. Now, there's no doubt the current water-based nuclear power plants come with significant risk. Chernobyl, Fukishama, 3 Mile Island are all incredible cases in point. Now, granted, most water-based nuclear power plants actually run very, very safely. I mean, the French track record with nuclear power plants speaks for itself. The problem with water-based with using nuclear power plants that are based on U-235 and water is when they go bang with a vengeance. The other thing too about U-235 using enriched uranium is that it's actually it's very, very fundamentally inefficient. But I would refer you to other sources to chase that down. That being said, there are other options. For example, the molten salt thorium nuclear option, and also to the Gates Foundation has also been funding research into modern nuclear power plants that can take into account use current nuclear waste to produce electricity. Now, to the greenies who are sticking with this discussion, now I know at this present point, if you subscribe to a lot of the green left view on things, you see nuclear as the work of Beelzebub / Lucifer himself. But here's the thing: particularly if we look at the molten salt thorium option, 5,000 tons of thorium provides the world's energy requirements for a year. And here's the thing: when your back is against the wall, you've got to come out swinging. So all options have to be on the table. But I'd encourage the listeners to look into that at their own time. And as far as I'm concerned, this has to be part of the mix. And the reason it's got to be part of the mix, if we're talking about steel generating hydrogen, generating synthetic fuels, you need a significant step up in your energy density, and nothing delivers that like nuclear. It is a given. So, wrapping this up, conclusions and takeaways. Battery-powered EV has a very important role to play. That being said, if we rely on this on its own, it's not going to be the solution. And it comes down to energy density. Currently, the energy density of battery cells, they're enough to be useful. They're not enough to be compelling. Hydrogen-powered EV offers some promise, but it needs time. And for all of these reasons, dispensing with the internal combustion engine is total madness, particularly once you start factoring in other energy generation routes that could eliminate the big bugbear of things like synthetic fuels, which is basically the amount of energy you need. So consequently, at this stage of the game, all options need to be on the table. But while battery-powered EVs have a great role to play, and companies like Tesla are to be commended for the great pioneering work that they have done. At the end of the day, to dispense with the internal combustion engine before the other technologies have matured appropriately is complete madness. And at that point, I shall conclude the discussion, and I look forward to catching up with you on the next episode of Dan's Vehicle Dynamics Corner.